Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the AFUL MagicOne. So I am late to the game. You've probably watched and read a million reviews, so I am not going to show you what is in the box or speak all their marketing terms. We'll just kind of dive into it, and we'll kind of start with a lot of the reviews start out with, oh my god, MagicOne is magic because it has bass. And I will say that years and years ago, this was my first experience with a single balanced armature set. This is the KB Ear F1. So this is the version, there's about 3 different drivers. This one is a Knowles driver, and it is a full range driver. It goes from about 11 kilohertz at the top end and the treble down to about 20 hertz. So full range driver, single balanced armature, in a resin block. It is a very cool set, and it actually is a very, very nice set, especially for the time. It's actually quite an amazing set, but that was my experience years ago of saying, wow, balanced armatures can actually do bass, and they do it quite well. This is the Etymotic ER4XR. So this is almost the benchmark set, or at least one of the benchmark sets for single balanced armatures. It is an amazing set. Pretty much flawless in what it does on extension from end to end. I don't think there's anything that's close to it below the price point. There's probably some things above it, but as far as a benchmark set of what a single balanced armature can do on a very extended frequency range, that is exactly what ER4 XR does. So I think other people were sort of blown away by MagicOne, and it seemed to be magical because it can do bass, and I wasn't so much blown away by what it does. And we'll just start with the graph and sort of poke at it a little bit. So the MagicOne, if you actually look at the MagicOne, AFUL put out a graph of what the driver looked like before they ran it through their circuit. It looked very much like F1. Bass curve had a dip here, and then you get a sort of shortened extension. So you can almost see what AFUL did with their magic circuitry, their resonator, and their LCR circuit. Didn't do a whole lot there. They lost some mid bass, and then really kind of smoothed out the treble and made it quite brighter and extended a bit. Yeah, kind of an interesting choice. So balanced armature, there just wasn't going to be a whole lot of bass no matter what they did. They threw a resonator on it and a lawn tube, all that stuff. Still didn't really hit the extension that they maybe had hoped for. It does something, but dropping the mid bass just makes not a whole lot of sense compared to where it was, and then to make it brighter. So this part makes this part even thinner. So yeah, if you actually listen to the two side by side, F1 actually sounds kind of more natural because it has some mid bass, and this ends up being more of a low pinna treble, and it still extends, but the way MagicOne made this brighter and dipped this, it's a very, very much a preference set, and I wouldn't call it an everyday set. I think it's going to target a few different people. F1 for me, and I shouldn't have AB F1, and I shouldn't have AB ER4, because they both do things a lot better than MagicOne does, but MagicOne does a couple things, and we'll jump into it. So yes, MagicOne does need a bunch of power. It needs even a lot more power than F1. F1 is actually easy to drive. This one is not so much. And it's also slightly picky. So flat sources, like your toppings, kind of like your SMSLs, they should sound like the graph. They should sound, kind of leaned out here and brighter here. If it sounds very warm, you have a warmer source, and that's where it's picking that up. But the sound, this is a balanced armature, so if you consider that as a dynamic driver bass shelf and think about what that would sound like with a balanced armature, it sounds a lot lower than what a dynamic driver. So the whole density and body of this is actually what you would think of as a much lower bass curve, and that's exactly what it should sound like on a flatter source. If you have a warmer source, it tends to be a little warmer, a little less technical, but it does pick up a more natural sound, and there's less BA timbre, I would say. If it sounds brighter, switch your sources, as it emphasizes all the glaring parts. So this one, again, like other hybrid sets or even AFUL sets that use their circuitry, this one is going to be tweaked a little bit by impedance, and the impedance makes this one brighter. So that is my ES100 and with 10 ohms. So 10 ohms, yeah, that's your zero red adapter. But if you have a dongle that does, some dongles are less than 1 ohm, some are 7, some are going to be 10. If you're at the higher end, you're going to get a much brighter version of MagicOne, and it definitely doesn't need that sort of brightness. So if it sounds off and glary, probably look into your source. So who should buy it? Bass heads? Nope, you kind of knew that one right away. Voxers, people who are really into vocals. If you really like your male and female vocals a little lighter and a little bit brighter, that one kind of fits you. If you are a cleaner or a resolver, if you like very, very clean sounding sets, you ask people which one is more resolving. Cleaners are people who like essentially no mid bass. I think this one hits you. I think the sharp attack on this and no mid bass really on the backside kind of fits that role model. I think you guys who really love the Harman dip, you guys look for dynamic drivers that drop way down here. So again, this thing looks like it's bass boosted, mid bass boosted, but it's actually not because it's a balanced armature and it's actually brought down. It sounds in your ear a lot lower, plus it's brighter, and this overrides what's going on there. So yeah, it sounds very clean for that reason. There's not a whole lot of mid bass, there's no mid bass bleed, and it's kind of bright. So treble timbre heads, yeah, you're kind of in, if you are the type who prioritizes timbre over stage and air in your treble area, I think this one hits you. But again, the wrong source will sound a little bit off. You get a little bit more BA timbre out of it. If you are an air person or a stage person, there's some fun because it's wide and it has some depth to it, but not a whole lot of height. So the basic question on this one is, did it really go beyond being good for a one balanced armature, right? And I think it didn't quite get there. I think they put a lot of work into it to get it to the point where they thought it was going to outperform other sets. But at the end of the day, it kind of basically sounds good for one BA. But are you going to replace your 1+1s or your 1+2s? Nah, not really. It's not quite that magical. Sound, it's somewhere between a lightweight neutral and a neutral bright. Again, it's even in their marketing words. It's just a little bit brighter than perhaps I prefer. Bass, they got that presence right? It kind of extends the way F1 does, and they kind of drop the mid bass, so it's just a little bit harder to hear. But I don't actually know what the resonator is doing when you look at it against the other sets. If you compare it against these two, it's really, really hard to determine what was going on, why they put that in there, and what it was supposed to do. And on top of that, the lack of mid bass, it never quite catches on to the mids. So that transition just sounds like it's missing. It sounds a little bit more digital than analog. But if you are into zero bass bleed, this one is for you. And I wasn't expecting rumble, like a big sub bass rumble, but I think any more mid bass would have done more harm to the resolution at lower volumes. It was just a really tough tuning decision as to what they did there and why they dropped that down. And again, I think they put in a ton of work to get this thing close. It's heavily marketed, the resonator, but it still sounds like a lean bass shelf, which will definitely appeal to people who are into very clean mids. There's kind of not a whole lot of bass going on underneath the mids. It's a very, very clean sounding set, kind of slightly analytical. Treble. So at first glance, I do think that they worked on the BA timbre. I think on certain sources that actually works out quite well. They smooth it out. Very much a controlled response. Again, it does vary quite a bit with source. It can be a little bit more glaring on other source, and definitely on your preferences. But on the flip side of that, the dynamic range is a bit like the bass. It's just blunted. Doesn't quite... It's kind of hard to describe what they did to the dynamic range. It sounds like a cheaper set, and the range is kind of constricted, and that ripples through on both ends because the bass, again, has this extension that's a little bit shortened, and on the treble, kind of the same thing happens. That constrained range limits the separation that you hear, and it limits the clarity and the transparency, and that ended up affecting how much mid bass they can put into it, because if they'd actually put more mid bass into it, that would mask even more of it. So I understand what they did on the tuning and why sort of the mid bass is where it is, because there's just not a whole lot of air going on. And if they put some more mid bass into it, that would have affected some of the detail and whatever detail you can hear in the mids. So I kind of get it. It was just, I'm not a huge fan of what their circuit does. I think Performer 8 had the same weirdness to it. And it very much appeals to certain people, just perhaps not me. It's just not very airy sounding, or it sounds, flat. So this type of sound, if you don't worry about air, then it sounds about right to you. If you worry about air, it's going to sound quite flat, but that really depends on who you are. So both of these things, kind of this kind of weird bassy thing going on, and then the weird treble with not much range, ends up rolling right into the mids. And this is, again, a relative thing of what you're used to. If you're used to one dynamic drivers, I think the BA detail, the speed, the forwardness, because there's no bass there, so the mids are very forward and kind of in your face. That sounds very clean, and that will be very attractive to you. I think this is why people buy hybrids. If you're very used to hybrids and multi-BA hybrids, you'll notice all the parts that are missing and harder to hear on this one because of this range, and there's no mid bass, and the dynamic range is a bit shortened. The things that you would typically look for in hybrids, that resolution, the dynamic range, the micro details, the textures, the decays, the reverberations, generally all the cues that bring you closer to being in the room and transparency, those things don't really come through on MagicOne. Again, I think it's part their circuit. I don't think it's actually the driver. I think F1 does a better job at it. ER4XR is kind of perfect at it. But what they did to try to smooth out the frequency response and the resonator, I think they lost a little bit. Perhaps they call it a little more natural, but they lost a little bit of what makes balanced armatures unique and special, and why people use them on hybrid sets. I think that kind of got lost along the way. I think MagicOne got the high-level playback of it sounding clear and somewhat detailed, but it never quite hits the in-the-room realism. There's just a lot of bits that are missing that don't come through on MagicOne. Stage, like I talked about, it's mostly wide. There is some depth to it. It's actually kind of fun to listen to, but there's just not much height, and a lot of that came down to the air and the treble. It's not a big sound stage. It kind of sounds very wide, and sometimes it sounds a little bit deep, but what's really missing is the height to it and some of that engagement that you would get from a bigger sound stage and more air, just a little bit more realism there that would have rippled through everything, but I think they chose a path that was away from that. So that is what I got on MagicOne. Thank you again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.